Okay, so we've got some variables here in our SMG animation blueprint, and we're ready to actually update the clip location. So let's go to the anim graph section here. Now we're going to create a simple state machine. So let's right click and we're going to type state machine and click add new state machine. So we can simply call this SMG state machine and we're going to hook this up. Now inside the state machine, double click that. We're going to create a state. So drag off, type state, and add a state. We're just going to call this default state. Now we're going to leave this state empty because we really don't need to animate our weapon. This is just our gun mesh. This doesn't need to be animated. All the magic is going to be done out here in the anim graph. So in the anim graph, what we're going to do is we're going to right click and type hand scene comp transform. We're going to get our hand scene comp transform. Now remember what this is. This is a transform that we created here on our animation blueprint. It's called hand scene comp transform. It's just a transform. We're setting it every frame in the event graph. What are we setting it to? Well, we're getting the shooter character, getting its hand scene component that we attached to the hand bone of the mesh. We're getting its world transform and we're setting it here. We're setting hand scene comp transform to that transform. Now we're going to use something called transform modify bone. Now right click and type transform modify bone and we'll see transform modify bone. And this takes a translation, a rotation, and a scale. And we can use the hand scene comp transform for that because what we're going to set is we're going to set the bone of our clip. We're going to set the SMG clip bone. So with transform modify bone selected, over here in the details panel, we can see bone to modify. And if we click the drop down, we can search for clip and we'll see that we can choose SMG clip. That's the bone we want to modify. Now, we're going to get the translation and rotation from our hand scene component transform by breaking this transform. So drag off of that and use a break transform node, and we can simply connect the location and the rotation. Now we don't even need to bother with the scale. We just want our scale to just stay at 111, which is basically the same as what the scale in this transform will be, so we don't even need to bother hooking that up. So now we have a transform modify bone node, and we're going to use the pose from our state machine here. So we can hold Alt and click to disconnect this state machine, and we can simply drag it in there. Now by default, we're automatically going to get a local to component node. This is taking our pose and converting it from local to component space. We need to do that for our transform modify bone. It works in component space. But then we can take our transform modify bone and simply connect it to the output pose, and then it'll go from component back to local space, just like we went from local to component. So this is an automatic node that we get. Now with transform modify bone selected, we're going to want to set the settings here in the details panel. So we've already set the bone to modify. Now in the translation section, for translation mode, we're going to click this drop down and use replace existing. So this transform modify bone is going to take this translation data we're passing in and replace the existing translation data for this clip bone. So we're basically overwriting that clip translation data. And we're also going to set this translation in world space because this transform we have is getting the translation data in that transform from the hand scene component of the character in world space. Remember, when we got it in C++, we used get world transform. Now for the rotation, we're also going to use replace existing, and we're also going to use world space for the same reasons. For the scale, we can simply ignore it because we don't really care about overwriting the scale. We can let it stay with a scale of 1. So now that we have all this, we can cache it. So go ahead and disconnect from the output pose and drag off of the component to local node and type cache, and we're going to save this as a cached pose. And we can save this as cached clip moved. So now we can use this. And the final thing we're going to do before plugging this into the output pose is we're going to check to see if we're moving the clip, because we don't want to use all this if we're not moving the clip. We're going to right click and use our moving clip boolean that we have on this animation blueprint. So we're going to use get moving clip, and the node we're going to use here is blend poses by bool. Blend poses by bool uses a boolean and will use a true pose and a false pose. If the boolean is true, it'll use the pose we hooked up to true pose. If the boolean is false, it'll use the pose we hooked up to false pose. So the boolean we're using is moving clip. So what are we going to use if we do need to move the clip? Well, we're going to use the result of this, the cached clip moved. So we're going to right click and say use cached, and we're going to say use cached pose, cached clip moved. That's going to be the true pose. But what's going to be the false pose? Well, we're going to use the pose unaltered by all of this. And that's going to be basically our SMG state machine, which gives us a good reason to cache this off, right? So let's go ahead and hold Alt, disconnect that, drag off of this, and type cache. And we're going to say new save cached pose. This is going to be the default pose. So let's name this cached default pose. And this we can comment and say default pose. We can put that up in the top. And we'll be just plugging this into our local to component. So right click and say use cached and select cached default pose. Plug that into local to component, which is going into the transform modify bone. And then finally down here for blend poses by bool, we're going to right click and say use cached, and we're going to choose cached default pose as our false pose. Okay, so let's go ahead and comment this part right here, and we're going to say transform the SMG underscore clip bone using hand scene comp transform location and rotation. And then down here, we can highlight this and use a comment that says use transformed bone only when moving clip is true. And then we can simply hook this up to output pose, and we can compile and save. So just to recap, what we did was we made a state machine that has an empty state. There's nothing in here. We're not driving this by any animation data. It's just an empty state machine. Now we're taking this and caching it and calling this cached default pose. Then we're taking that default pose and running it through a transform modify bone node, and transform modify bone takes a bone to modify. In the dropdown here, we're choosing the clip, SMG clip. And then we override the translation and rotation with the translation and rotation from the transform called hand scene component transform. This we're updating every tick and getting the transform from the scene component on our character. Then we go back from component to local and cache this and call this cached clip moved. Now, rather than plugging that straight into output pose, we want to blend poses by bool by checking first to see if moving clip is true. If it's true, then we use the cached clip moved. But if it's false, we simply use the default pose, and we plug that into the output pose. Now, the last thing we need to do is simply use this animation blueprint on our base weapon. So let's go and open base weapon BP, select our item mesh, and here in animation, we can use an animation blueprint. So go ahead and click the drop down, and we're going to search for our SMG anim BP. And here it is right here. So we can compile and save that. Okay, so that sets up everything. And thanks to our animation blueprint, and thanks to transform modify bone, we should be moving this clip at least when moving clip is set to true. So let's go ahead and give this a test run. I'm going to hit play. I'm going to shoot a round off, or 3 or 4. And then I'm going to reload the weapon. I'm paying close attention to that clip that's sticking out below her arm. And we get a crash, which means we're likely accessing a null pointer. And it happened exactly at the point where we tried to grab the clip. So that tells me that this is linked to the grab clip function. So let's take a look at that. So here we are in grab clip, and let's walk through this to see if we can figure out where we're getting a crash. So the first thing we do is check if equipped weapon is null, and then we return. So I already know that we're not accessing equipped weapon when it's null because we won't even make it that far in the function. So this line here, we're getting the clip bone index by calling equipped weapons get item mesh, which is calling get bone index, and passing in the equipped weapons get clip bone name. That all seems to look okay. Let's look at the next line, clip transform. We're getting that by getting equipped weapon, getting the mesh, calling get bone transform, and passing in a clip bone index. That seems to look okay as well. Then we create an F attachment transform rules struct. That line looks okay. And then we're getting our hand scene component, and we're calling attach to component. Now, check this out. We're accessing hand scene component, and we never actually checked to see if that was null. And in fact, yes, it is null. We never actually created our hand scene component. All we did was declare a variable of type hand scene component pointer. So there's going to be a couple things we're going to do to fix this. First, we're going to check to see if hand scene component is equal to null pointer. And if that's true, we're going to return because we don't want to try to access hand scene component. That will cause a crash, which we saw it did. Now, second, we need to make sure hand scene component is actually constructed. Whenever we have a component, we have to make sure it's constructed in the constructor. So let's go up to our constructor. And just down here at the bottom of our constructor, we're going to need to construct our hand scene component. So we're going to say hand scene component equals create default subobject, and it's going to be a uScene component, and it needs a text macro with our text name. We'll call this hand scene comp. Now this is a scene component, and really we don't even need to attach it to anything because GrabClip is going to handle the attachment. We're going to attach it to our hand bone. So all we need to do is make sure that it's created. So let's give this a comment and say create hand scene component, and we can simply compile this. I'm going to hit Control F5 so that it kicks up the editor when it finishes compiling, since we crashed it and it's not open anymore. So there we have it. It's compiling. We're opening the editor, and we can try this again. Okay, here's the editor. I'm going to play test this one more time. I'm going to hit play. I'm going to fire off a couple rounds. And then I'm going to hit the R key and observe our animation and see if that clip moves. So let's hit R. And there it goes. Yes, it is working properly. I'm going to go ahead and swap weapons for this burst SMG and see if this one will also move. Let's hit the R key. There it goes, the moving clip. The clip will move along with the hand because it is using that hand scene component transform. That is beautiful. So that is going to go ahead and conclude this video. In the next video, we're going to handle adding some sound effects to all these things that we're doing. We're going to add a weapon equipping sound effect. We're going to add a sound effect for when we swap weapons, and we're going to add a sound effect for when we drop weapons. So we're going to need some sounds, and this is going to make everything sound a lot more fun. So we'll see you in the next video.